You see these 4 pieces of bread. They were baked in the same oven, on the same rack, at the same temperature, for the same amount of time. And yet, they all browned differently. What could possibly make such a difference? The baking sheets. There's so much professional chefs don't bother telling home cooks about the baking sheets. They are not trying to hide anything from you. They just don't give any thought to the fact that their baking sheets look like this and yours looks like this. I didn't give it any thought either until I bought new baking sheets for the first time in 20 years, and that experience was eye-opening. This 18 by 13 shallow baking sheet is called a half sheet. This is the oven workhorse of any kitchen. The 2 main tasks it does for me is roasting vegetables and baking pastries, cookies and other doughs. The half sheets you've seen in all my videos until recently are roughly 20 years old. I got them from a restaurant supply store when I got my first restaurant job. When I started teaching classes, students started asking me for baking sheet recommendations. Since I wasn't sure what brand my half sheets were, I suggested Nordic Ware to my students. Since Cooks Illustrated and Seriesits.com recommended this brand, I was sure it would be fine. A few months ago, I decided to try Nordic Ware half sheets myself, and to my surprise, they browned terribly. They also were way more sticky than my old ones. I started panicking that all these years I've been recommending bad half sheets, so I tried 2 other brands, Winco and Woolworth, and they performed just as badly. Of course, what I quickly realized was that the new half sheets weren't bad. They were just new. Years of grease baked into my old baking sheets is what made them brown so quickly. I mean, they're practically black underneath, and the darker the material, the more heat it absorbs. But there is a silver lining to those shiny new baking sheets. They don't burn the bottom of my pastries like the old ones did. Working with the new baking sheets gave me a whole new appreciation of how incredibly misleading the recipes can be. Yeah, that includes my recipes. Here's how most of them are worded. Bake butternut squash at 425 Fahrenheit until brown, 25 to 30 minutes. When people read this, they are thinking that some ovens and baking sheets will take 25 minutes and some will take 30 minutes. And that is not even close. 425 on a grungy baking sheet might produce browning after 25 minutes, but 425 on a shiny baking sheet might result in the vegetables sweating, which means you won't see any color at 30 or 40 or even 50 minutes. If the vegetable starts to sweat, you can kiss that browning goodbye. Recipes always give time ranges, but not the temperature ranges, and that's a bummer. I had to crank up my oven 50 degrees to get my new baking sheets to roast veggies the way my old ones did. Of course, that has its limitations, since most home ovens only go up to 500 degrees, and at some point you can't crank it up anymore. My other pet peeve with shiny new half sheets was roasting acidic ingredients like tomatoes or apples. I used to do that all the time, but on a new baking sheet, acidity can react with aluminum and make your food taste metallic. The question is, do we really need to wait a few years for the baking sheets to age? Can't we just speed up the process? I searched all over the web for baking sheet seasoning instructions, but came up with nothing. Luckily, I had more baking sheets on my hands than I knew what to do with, so I thought, why not experiment? I wrapped 2 of my new baking sheets with the thinnest possible coating of canola oil and baked them empty for a couple of hours. This darkened them quite a bit, and it seemed to me that they were browning the vegetables way better. It also seemed that the sticking was significantly reduced. To see how they compared to my 20-year-old sheets and the shiny new sheets, I wanted to set up an experiment. The question was, what to brown? I felt that vegetables were not uniform enough for a good test. Even cookie dough wasn't uniform enough. What if I rolled some of it a little thicker and some a little thinner? After considering all sorts of ingredients, I finally came up with the perfect test material: Wonder Bread. What can be more uniform and homogeneous? After 100 years in production, this American culinary wonder finally found its true calling. I baked 8 pieces of Wonder Bread on a new unseasoned baking sheet, on a new seasoned baking sheet, on my 20-year-old baking sheet, and on a piece of parchment paper slid directly onto the oven rack with no baking sheet at all. All samples were baked at 400 degrees for 8 minutes in the middle of the oven. The top of the bread looked similar for all the samples, but look at the bottom. The new unseasoned baking sheet produced the wimpiest brownie. The new seasoned baking sheet did a lot better. The 20-year-old baking sheet did even better, and the parchment paper with no baking sheet underneath got the bread almost burnt. This means that my seasoning process was making a real difference. Given how quickly and easily you can season your baking sheets, I think it's completely worth it. All standard half sheets are made out of aluminum, and we can season it just like cast iron. The key here is to make your layer of oil insanely thin. Keep rubbing it off with a paper towel until you can barely tell that it's there at all. Rub both the inside and the outside of the baking sheet. Darkening the outside helps with browning just as much as darkening the inside. Start baking your sheet upside down at 425 Fahrenheit for 1 hour. This way the oil won't pool in the corners. Then flip it over and bake another hour. Once the baking sheet cools off, the oil should feel rock hard. It should not feel greasy or sticky. If it's sticky, you might have applied a tad too much oil. This is not a biggie, but thicker layers of oil peel off easier than thinner layers. If the oil is sticky after the baking sheet cools off, just bake it again for an hour or 2. I promise that at some point the oil will turn completely hard. By the way, it's normal for the baking sheets to warp slightly during seasoning, but they should return to their original shape after cooling. At first, I wasn't sure where my newly seasoned baking sheet stood with acidity. Acidity is generally not good for seasoning, so I decided to proceed with caution. I avoided using anything acidic the first 10 times I roasted veggies, and then gave it a try. The seasoning was absolutely fine, and now I splash my veggies with lemon juice after they are roasted all the time. So use your best judgment. Once your seasoning stops peeling and chipping, you'll be amazed at how durable it can be. If you want to keep your seasoning, it's crucial that you wash the baking sheets correctly. Using soap is absolutely fine. Once the oil becomes hard, it's impossible to wash it off with soap and water. In the beginning, some seasoning might peel off when you wash the pans. See, I lost it in a few spots, but then it started to build up again as I kept using the baking sheets. Just make sure not to scrub your half sheets with steel wool or any harsh chemicals. And of course, don't put them in the dishwasher. Keep in mind that seasoning is a two-edged sword. Your vegetables will roast a lot better, but your pastries might start to burn on the bottom. I have lived with pastries burning my entire life. All these years, I thought it was my oven's fault when it was actually my half sheets. From now on, I'll always have 2 sets of half sheets, the shiny new ones for the pastries and the dark seasoned ones for the veggies. You might be wondering, why not just lower the temperature on those dark half sheets? Great question. That's because I need those pies and croissants to brown on top as well. With the lower temperature, the top doesn't brown sufficiently. If this is a problem with your baked goods, instead of lowering the temperature, you can try sliding a rimless baking sheet underneath toward the end of baking to insulate the bottom. Sometimes I even do it with my shiny new baking sheets. No matter what the marketing materials tell you, all half sheets warp. But they don't all warp the same way. It's important to distinguish between good warping and bad warping, because it can make a very dramatic difference in browning. The truly evil warping is when the baking sheet twists. Then it becomes completely useless. Most decent brands of commercial half sheets don't do that. The more common warping you'll see is when the center pops up or pops down. If it pops up, the oil will run to the edges of the sheet. If it pops down, the oil will run into the middle. I much prefer the situation when the center pops up because that drives the oil to the hotter parts of the baking sheet, which is the outside. If the center pops down, the outer pieces are left high and dry with no oil to lubricate them and end up burning. Out of the 3 half-sheet brands that I've tried, only Woolworth consistently worked in a good way, with the center popping up slightly. When pans turned into shallow bowls after the very first use, see how they wobble on the counter and drive the oil away from the outside? I would not buy them again. I had mixed luck with the Nordic Ware pans. One of them had the center pop up and the other one had the center pop down. I contacted Nordic Ware and they sent me a new sheet free of charge to replace the one that became wobbly after its center popped down. The next sheet is doing fine and works just as well as Woolworth. In the beginning, I found the bumpy Nordic Ware logo off-putting. I mean that they really have to put it right on the cooking surface, but it's really not a biggie since you don't want to scrub your sheets to the shiny state anyway if you are using them for cooking. And if you're using them for baking, you'll probably use parchment paper. If I had to buy another baking sheet, I'd go with Woolworth, since that's the brand that gave me no trouble. The link for these half sheets is in the description below. We haven't yet discussed the seriously burnt piece of bread that was baked on a parchment paper with no baking sheet at all. Removing the baking sheet meant that I didn't get much heat through conduction. That's the energy transfer you get when 2 solid objects touch each other. The only place I got any conduction was where the rods of the rack touched the parchment. But what I lost in conduction, I more than made up for in radiation. That's the transfer of energy through the air. A baking sheet will block a lot of this radiation, so removing it will give you pretty insane browning. This means that instead of using a pizza stone or a pizza steel to bake your pizza, you can just slide the parchment with the pizza directly onto your oven rack and get pretty incredible browning. Pizza stones and steels are great, but they're heavy, they cost a lot, and they require a lot of time to heat up. So if you don't have one, there is another option. A huge thank you to my student, Katie Kenny, for helping me discover this pizza hack. A few disclaimers: I've only tested this in a gas oven, so I don't know if it works as well in electric, and I compared the browning to my pizza stone because I don't have a pizza steel. I'm not saying you wasted your money on a pizza steel. I'm sure it browns great, but if you ever find yourself without a pizza stone or a steel, your best bet is to get rid of the baking sheet. I hope this video will help you become the master of oven browning. Here are more very thought-provoking culinary videos for you to check out, and the link to my online classes is in the description below.